Good evening, everyone, and happy Juneteenth. My name is Kara Singleton, and I'm the Executive Director of the Royal House and Slave Quarters, a museum located in Medford. Thank you so much for spending your Friday night with us for the first event in the Royal House and Slave Quarters poetry series called Poetry is Protest. I would also be remiss to not thank Lucia Marconi, one of our amazing board members for the Royal House, who is behind the scenes making sure everything runs smoothly. Tonight is a night of collaboration. We are so happy to join in partnership with the Shaw 54th Regiment Memorial Committee to present tonight's poetry reading with Dr. Malcolm Tariq. I'd like to personally thank the Museum of African American History, the National Park Service, Friends of the Public Garden, and the City of Boston for helping make tonight possible. This event also serves as a continuation of the Shaw 54th Restoring the Memorial and the Dialogue on Race, a series first introduced at an event at Tremont Temple. This year, Juneteenth 2020, coincides with a pandemic within a pandemic. The challenge of COVID-19 and America's reckoning with its history of racism, police brutality, and white supremacy. As we all fight to make sure that Black lives matter, the Royal House and Slave Quarters and the Shaw 54th Memorial Committee wanted to host an event that also highlights how Black expression saves Black lives, to quote the words of Dr. Malcolm Tariq. Beyond the memorialization of Black history through the preservation of the slave quarters and the renewal of the iconic Shaw 54th Monument, as partners hosting this event, we seek to educate, inform, and convene community conversations and special programs that explore history, racism, and social justice. We hope these dialogues will lead to greater understanding and ultimately social change, which is long overdue. In many ways, it was extremely easy to come together around this event because we all have a deep vested interest in memorializing the underrepresented. And what better way than to do that on Juneteenth, a holiday that began in Galveston, Texas, after the last of enslaved people learned that they were freed. Yet that freedom was met with resistance and extreme violence from white citizens invested in the institution of slavery. Thus, Juneteenth reminds us that freedom was never given to African Americans, but that Black people have always insisted on their right to be free and to define what freedom looks like. So when we celebrate Juneteenth, we also highlight the many historical and present day blockades that seek to deny African Americans justice and equality. And we celebrate the will to not only imagine, but to make a more just present and future. We are now going to hear from Lamerchi Frazier, who is a public fiber artist, innovator, poet, and the Director of Education and Interpretation for the Museum of African American History.
Thank you, Kiara. The Massachusetts 54th, where storms of death were sweeping wildly through the darkened sky, stood the bold but faded column, brave to do, to dare, and die. Barriers of a high commission to break each other's chain, with hearts aglow for freedom, they bore the toil and pain. Oh, not in vain those heroes fell. Amid those hours of fearful strife, each dying heart poured out a balm to heal the wounded nation's life. And ages yet uncrossed with life as sacred urns do hold each mound, where sleep the royal, loyal, true and brave in freedom's consecrated ground. These are the words of Frances Ellen Watkins Hoffer, poet and activist of the 19th century, that were published in the Anglo-African newspaper, October the 10th, 1863. Frances Ellen Watkins Hoffer is hailing the story of the 54th that we just heard excerpts of in her poetry here, as she is a part of the canon of the traditional art of poetry as resistance and art document of time that begins with public publishing of Phillis Wheatley, her various poems, Religious and Moral, in 1773, and on to Paul Laurence Dunbar, who is the poet laureate of the 19th century And one of his poems relevant to us today is We Wear the Mask. As we think about what we're going to enjoy tonight, is a continuation of this tradition over centuries of African American poetry that gives us light from a dark space, that gives us light into a better future. It is with this that I greet you on behalf of the Museum of African American History, its president and board, and the staff. I am director of education there, where I get to look at what is a collection of documents and evidence of the life and lives of significant people, ordinary people in everyday life that have done extraordinary things to bring freedom and justice, to have an ongoing conversation in that area for us to be able to witness, along with the collections of the Museum of African American History and the collection of the Royal House. We can prove evidence of the contributions of these glorious people that we represent. It is the story of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment that was a part of the margins to be raised in the Emancipation Proclamation issued 1863, January the 1st, by President Abraham Lincoln, the second Emancipation Proclamation to be raised. It is this first regiment to be raised in the North of African American volunteers, authorized and mustered into service by May 13, 1863, who had trained in Hyde Park at Camp Meigs. They were the first men and thereby seized their golden opportunity and their first best chance to establish a claim to the full rights of American citizenship. They were to prove themselves and had already been a part of Black militias that had established themselves here in Massachusetts, and were recruited, those 1,200 men from Massachusetts, from Canada, from New York, from Ohio, from Haiti, and they were received with their colors, their flags, their banners on Beacon Hill, May the 28th, 1863, on their way to Boston's Harbor to then fight at Fort Wagner. On their way to Boston's Harbor, they are met with Frederick Douglass shaking their hands as they board the De Morlaix for venture and travel to Fort Wagner. Importantly, these men were met with 1,000 revelers on Beacon Hill who heralded them, who were sending them off on their way in hopes of a brighter future for America. As we think about these men, these 1,200 men, we want to think about the significance of being brave enough to stand up inside themselves and to support the cause of democracy, to support the ending of slavery. And as we tell their story, and there are many in this story of the monument and what it represents in America's public landscapes for democracy, we have to look at why we have this monument and the significance of one African American free Black man whose name was Joshua Bowdoin Smith, who brought to the attention of the Boston community that we needed a monument after the battle that the men lost in Fort Wagner, but won for the war. He raises the issue in 1863 after the men who have wanted a monument on Morris Island in South Carolina and are not able to achieve it. So as he does the first fundraising and he issues his own money as a Black entrepreneur and caterer who had been affiliated with the Shaw family, he is warned by Senator Charles Sumner that we might want to wait until after the war is over in 1865 to raise this. With that, Augustus St. Gaudens, as the artist, is chosen for the commission. And what it is to take 2 years actually takes 14, because the Shaw family calls for a redesign of the monument, not from the perspective of a lone man on a horse, but they demand that he be shown with his men in the 54. And so that process takes quite a while. And it is finished and then is presented to the community in 1897. This is an embodiment of the will and desire of communities across America. It is the most treasured of 10 monuments in America. As we think about the monuments that are being called into question, this one is one that is embodying the notion of freedom and justice. As we think about the art that is in this sculpture and the importance of raising a restoration project to keep it going, we can visit the moment of 1982 when the names of the Black soldiers who have fallen at Fort Wagner are added to its back. We can look at it as a continuing conversation as we are raising its restoration today. I want to then think about with you in this conversation as we listen to the wonderful words of Dr. Malcolm Tariq, that we continue this art of poetry as a voice of resistance. And that as we think about the Restoration Committee and its efforts to raise the mantle of the 54th Regiment Shaw Memorial, we want to think about the things that they have done to keep the stories going. Though it is under restoration, they have created an app called the Overlay that will give you the stories that are many at the monument if you visit it. There is online at the Shaw Memorial at Home, the Shaw 54th Memorial at Home, and access to the app and the stories where you can understand how to access them. It is done through a process of augmented reality, which is an innovative method of being able to produce stories and reimagine while you are looking at the monument online or in physical person at the monument. So we'd like to urge you to keep up with our ongoing conversations. This is one in a process of conversations that have begun in 2019 to hail the importance and significance of this national treasure in our midst in Boston. We want to ask you to please join us in this series with the Royal House Poetry as Protest and tonight's wonderful feature of Dr. Malcolm Tariq. And I will now turn the mic back to Kiera Singleton to introduce Dr. Tariq.
Thank you, Lamerchi. Okay, so let's move on to what you all have been waiting for, which is to hear some beautiful poetry read by Dr. Tariq. Malcolm Tariq is a poet and playwright from Savannah, Georgia. He is the author of Heed the Hollow, winner of the 2018 Cave Canem Poetry Prize, and is the 2020-2021 playwright resident with the Liberation Theater Company. He is also the recent recipient of the Georgia Author of the Year Award. He's a graduate of Emory University. He has a PhD in English from the University of Michigan. Malcolm lives in Brooklyn, New York City, where he is the Programs and Communication Manager for the Cave Canem Foundation, a home for Black poetry. About Malcolm's book, Heed the Hollow. Heed the Hollow introduces the work of Malcolm Tariq, whose poems explore the concept of the bottom across Blackness, sexuality, in the American South. In bops, lyrics, and erasures, Heed the Hollow tells of a heritage anchored to the landscape of the coastal South, to seawalls shaped by forced labor, and to people marked into the bottom of history where then now we find no shadow of light. From that shadow, the voices in these poems make their own brightness, reclaiming their histories from a language that evolved to exclude them. Kamara Brown is a PhD candidate in American Studies at Harvard University, where she writes about poetry, care, gender, sexuality, Black feminisms, and transnational women of color. She will be leading Malcolm in a talk back. after he finishes his reading. Her interdisciplinary study draws methods and reading practices from both history and literary studies to ask directly, what can historians learn about doing history from poetry? Kamara is also a poet. Her poetry has been published in the Adroit Journal, Bedfellows, and the Golden Shovel Anthology, New Poems Honoring Gwendolyn Brooks, as well as circulated in a collection curated by poet Lainey Brown titled Solidarity Text. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Malcolm Tariq.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Can't. I'm just gonna assume everybody can. Thank you, Kiera, for those wonderful remarks, and for everybody for organizing this and setting it up and inviting me. And I'm excited for the conversation later with Kamara, who's a great writer, so I know she'll have some interesting insights. I just hope I'm ready. This is also probably the most I've been called Dr. Tariq in one time in my life, so that's something funny to me. I'm just gonna take us through the book. This is Heat the Hollow. Yeah, so this first poem is called Power Bottom. In church, we said, Satan, get thee behind, and I always laughed. A demon child with a twisted mouth. At supper, I refused meat to suck on bones in the alley behind the house. What grew besides berries I was told not to touch. I licked the blood at the root. A bitter crop, I came screaming, never tell me to be quiet again. I know what life the one sucks, but what hits harder than a hungry hand scorned by a gallant sow. I wanted to try me. Trust me, you've never felt a mouth this sweet, this thorny. They said somebody put sugar in his tank. I thought myself an army. Commander, when I tell you to fuck me, I don't mean for your tree to drop in a spirit-filled chamber of burning flesh. I mean, grow a thicker root. I mean to say crow, pluck me. Too much sweetness can kill you, and this plantation can never be too used. In the end, I will have you hung up, trapped in my southern breeze. The next poem I'm going to read is an erasure. An erasure is a practice by which you take a text and then you erase certain words, and what's left of the text is the new poem or finished product, what have you. It's not just a literary technique. People also do this in the visual arts as well. So this is an erasure of George Washington's last will and testament. I was interested in, one of my leading questions was trying to figure out if George Washington was our first Southern president, and I discovered he was not. Like, the South was not a thing when George Washington was born. But also George Washington had this, I don't lie about George Washington, I don't know why, but he had this fascination, or he just really loved hot chocolate. And so I wanted to write a poem about like Blackness and chocolate in the president's mouth, because some people may know this, it's becoming more known now, but some of his teeth, a lot of his teeth were false, and some of them he bought from Black people who he owned. They found this as evidence in his inventory after he died. There's an article, I think, called like The 9 Lives of George Washington's Teeth, that's on the internet somewhere if you're interested. But as I was doing this erasure, I remembered about the teeth coming from these people who he owns. And so this is the finished product of that erasure. It's called Self-Portrait as George Washington's Teeth. I, instrument of circumstance, hold most difficult sensations from bodily infirmities fed by, bound by Negro crops. Permanent provision is alternative testimony of his attachment to me. Trust this donation vested in misconceptions, meaning the pleasure of prejudice, so desirable an object as good matter. Public mind, pregnant country, limits my honorable body, some object I, legal alien I, Negro made as evidence of desire. my private, my share, the original design of my head for me to him unsheaths blood for unsheathed domain bounded at the gum to the mouth of his person. My whole deed, 2/3 joint uses and benefits to the stone and oak of the South. Thence I hold all the rest in residue of lying. Desire cannot be made without my parts. 4 parts, 1 part to each 5 other parts, 1 to 4 parts, 1 part each give 2 parts, 1 part 3 parts, 1 part to each 1 other part, that is to each 1/3 of that part, 3 other parts of person is unknown to him. To take stock and repair a new one of brick, to remain entombed here without oration, to digest his sense of intention, I, binding witness of the state. This next poem is called Deep Root. The last line is from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. I think it's a part towards the end when the main character is in Harlem and this person is selling yams on the corner or on the street, and someone says, I am what I am and nothing else. No, someone says, I am what I am. The rest of that is me. But I am what I am. And so this poem is about, to me, it's about queerness and belonging in the South, and also naming something, naming oneself, and also being named by someone else. Deep root. Consider its motherly grip, the land that bends but never breaks us, how the root of it bends and bends like a crooked finger pointed at me or from or curving inwards both ways at once, its tiny veins extracting its very life from soil it now calls its own. Here I am made into a likeness, sun native to its shape, a whip laid bare on my flesh, homing hurt. Father, in our silence we speak in tongues, and the dirt in my mouth crops the sweet potato, its deep root lodged south in my throat. Consider the fact of it is but a root itself, the shape of it posed as a heart. However conflicted this nation, this body, I am what I am and nothing else. This one, it's very fun to read. This is a sestina. A sestina is a poetic form in which there are 6 stanzas of 6 lines each, and each line ends, each line, how do I explain this? The end of each line in every stanza, the same 6 words appear, but in different patterns. Diversity.
Hi, everyone. We're having a little bit of bandwidth issues, but just hold on 1 second and Malcolm will be back.
Okay. I think I'm back. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna start over in case somebody, I don't know when I cut off. So this is a poem called Sugar. It's a sestina, 6 lines, 6 stanzas, 6 words in each stanza. Every line ends in the same 6 words. It's dedicated to Dr. Rudolph Bird, who was my professor at Emory. It's the last class he taught. before he died. And I've been thinking lately that he was I believe, the only openly gay teacher I had, Black gay teacher growing up, so even before college. And so this poem is just in memory of him, and also the book is dedicated to him. Okay, sorry, my camera was off. So this is Sugar. I want you to remember everything I've suffered. Cracked hands, bent back, wrought mouthful of cane scored with sorrow songs of a slave soul. My fill hand works command. With its harvest without the promise of more, a sea of red my flesh will surrender. Such terror to desire sweet. Torture me with beauty. I am the whole history of sweet. Can't you see it? My skin, like dusk I've suffered to pull back. Endless stretch of red running valley deep. Yielding throat, cane lip scented mouth. I crave more than harvest. The promise that God's body must have a soul. Black isn't made to live. My body is opaque to the soul. This boundless bounty of muscadine, scuppernong, sweet gum, honeysuckle, pine, I am every man's harvest. Each one has entered a sticky field and suffered a failure to leave, has opened his throat to cane stalk, has gotten lost feasting deep in the red. Who says God would not dare suck black red blood? Black, magnetically so, midnight soul, towering majestic black bodies of ripe cane, black reapers swinging scythes sharpened for sweet conquest, black balanced and pulled against to suffer pure sugar as subtlety, black turning a white harvest. An orgy for some genius of the South is harvest. I dance as the tongues of flames of a red burning moon. Even my blood has suffered. One uncle died of diabetes, another a queer soul with too much sugar, a cup runneth over, sweet. Listen, I am nothing but cane. I am nothing but wind whistling in cane. And me, I am nothing but this dark field of cane. And me, I am the reaper weeping at harvest. And me, even my pain is beautiful and sweet. And me, my throat opens wide to be read. And me, my mind too is opaque to the soul. And me, heaving ephemeral flesh, I suffer. I want to read, okay, so this poem almost did not make it into the book, but some of my friends told me I had to keep it in. So the book is separated into 4 sections. There's a poem called Malcolm Tariq's Black Bottom in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd section, different poems of the same title. This one is about cake, and there's different scenes. They just like go into different scenes. So it's a lot of it you'll recognize, like Debbie cakes and I forget this other type of candy cake. What is it called? There's this other type of cake. It's not a hostess, but anyway. And then it goes into a cakewalk. And then there's the last scene, I think, is like a queer ball. Like if you watch Pose, for example, or if you've seen Paris is Burning, that type of walk. And so, yeah, this is Malcolm Tariq's Black Bottom. His tasty cake, his double-licious candy cake, the bounds of his little Debbie cake, little subtle stretch marks of it makes a zebra cake, playing hostess for ho-hos, no Twinkies, but ding-dong cake, pound by pound cake, pounded, smacked until it's red velvet cake, on the serving plate in its birthday suit in the birthday suite, the sweet birthday cake as wished, on the moon pie as wanted by teeth, tongue, when upside down cake, feast for days, cake, feast for eyes, watch it now, cake, walk the cakewalk, call swipesy your attention in ragtime, turn a precise corner, the fine point, ain't no cakewalk, belle of the ball, cake, walks, imitates its own trade, marked real cake, drop cake, this cake walks the floor not to be judged by the master of the cakewalk trade, though he watched cake, got a sweet tooth for surprise, cake, Wants a sponge cake, but this cake be its own prize, snatched like a real cake. No devil square will devil cream or snowball. This cocoa cream cake will walk brains out in form. Cake be its own. You cannot take cake. You cannot have cake, although you may eat it. This is very relevant to life right now. This is called a body politic. I wrote it thinking about trying to explain the body politic to classes I was teaching, which largely consisted of young white students, and then thinking about just experiences growing up. Anything else you need to know about this poem? No. Oh, I also wrote this poem because well, this is not why I wrote it, but as I was writing the book, I thought I was saying the word body too much. And then I wrote this poem where body appears like more than 30 times. It kind of defeated the purpose. The body politic. Say this isn't the whole of it, this frail book in its sentence. Somebody's too good and no good grin. Somebody's god awful and too full mouth. Somebody's tired. Somebody rattles the cage, another will die under. Somebody's sickle and somebody's cell. Somebody be out there cotton picking mine. Somebody else be all up in it. I mean the weight of a dime in my hand before collection. I'm talking Sunday be somebody's lifeline. Somebody's prison whose body's a pipeline. Teacher's judgment against my house collateral. I'm counting books and lives, putting money on books and bailouts. Despite this black president, I'm thinking slumlords and thug porn. Family courting the law while your mama's so fat and somebody's big black. 3/5 a body's sum, bodies worked in inches, whose back a bridge, whose broken daddy's back on crack, somebody stepped on the beat, we dug it. A body was bodied while politicking who done it. Somebody's well-meaning and good intention, somebody's everyday and everybody you love, somebody's lost. Nobody's somebody you can't get back, somebody something paid for it. Somebody's wound be somebody's gun, somebody's baby against bullet, the plot quickens. Headstone bodies be bodying days. Centuries bookend the dash, our lives will fit within it. Our lives will abandon the boundaries of the body the way some bodies belong to the state. I stay stating my name like it matters. I am, and I am, and I am. This is a poem called Slave Play. I'm searching for freedom within this bondage, liking it to the Holy Spirit that caught my mother one Sunday. As she bent to buckle, I fled the body that asked my own to speak so freely in foreign. Such would be my safe word were I as daring. My body can break open at will. It's the mind that cannot. Insert cuffs and I'll think shackles, say whip and I'll picture a tree carved into flesh. So why am I on my knees again with hands for a stepping stool and a mouth's forum of folly for a chalice? This is my body, eat me all of it. A black man tells me to call him a nigger. A white man wants to collar train me. See how I am both the dog and the bone. Dom, I shall not want. Lead me beside the still kudzu. Entangle me within the loss of generations. I know who will lead me into this, but who will bring me out? Oh, master, teach me new ways to say I want when the tongue is but a muscle flexed on which word to be hung. Live by the word the pastor tells me. I'll die by it. If not, by these feet bound one to the other, command me to follow. Oh God, what have I become? So, where should it go now? So this poem is from if I can find it. I took a trip to Charleston to visit some slave cabins, as they're called, places that enslaved Black people lived on plantations. And somehow when I was there, I got led to Sullivan's Island, which is in Charleston. And it's also the place where, up until a certain point, every, well, most, they say every, maybe it's most, slave ships that from the Atlantic slave trade that were coming to the States stopped in Sullivan's Island as like a holding cell kind of. And so the Black people would then spend time in the holding cell for like a month, just in case they had any sicknesses or illnesses before they went to auction. And so the story is that most Black people in the United States can trace their lineage back to Sullivan's Island, back to this entry point. The Toni Morrison Society started this project called A Bench by the Road, where they place a bench in places that are specific to slavery in North America. And some of the benches are in communities that are just very specific to like racial or like Black history. But the first bench was placed on Sullivan's Island, and it's from, I think Toni Morrison had a quote in one of her essays that there's no place that we can go to really think about slavery or reflect on its influence on the country. And so they started this project to place benches next to places that were specific to that history. This is, so I went to Sullivan's Island, and so this is just my experiences going to, also on Sullivan's Island, on Folk Moultrie that's on the island. It was like, I think a World War I, World War II military base. So if you go visit, most of the history that you're gonna see, or the monuments or whatnot, are to that and not to this other, the previous history that mainly had to do with Black life. There's a plaque there, and then if you know about the Toni Morrison bench, you will find that, but that's about it. On Sullivan's Island, I heed a path trodden for me before. I am this impaired, forgetting and forgetting and forgetting. What else is this wave crashing into shore but an attempt to cleave remembrance? Overhead, the dark sky engulfs the low country, once welcome spot in terror for the ancestors, always a nest for the captors. Now baby strollers and casual dog walks file before a single marquee meant to hold place for history, leisure where once labor. What work have I come here to do besides witness? I go from shore to shore, seeking clarity, to stand on the threshold of past and present where land and sea court death. I search my mind for what remains of generational sanity. There is nothing but bondage. Overhead, the sign reads, deadly currents, deep holes, and forbids the swim out. I could chase the distance with salt. I could run face forward into what has already claimed me without regret. This ocean swallows the whole of me. I could join it or become another buoy signaling loss. And on the topic of monuments, also on that trip, I went to the McLeod plantation site that's also in Charleston. And there's this portion of, there's this plot of land near the site that they call, I think, the African American Burial Ground. And I think that they wanted to build a firehouse on that land, but then they discovered that underneath was 99 bodies of Black people that were buried and unmarked. And the bodies were so entangled into the land that they couldn't be excavated and removed or even looked through, I guess. And so these bodies are just a part of the land now. And so they partitioned this part off and call it the African American Burial Ground. And then, I'm forgetting the year, was it 2000? Just say a few years ago, a white supremacist entered a church in Charleston and murdered, I think, 9 innocent Black worshipers. And that same person went to sites that were specific to Black life and Black history in Charleston and took photos saluting the Confederacy and white power. And this was one of the sites that he went to, I discovered later. So this is self-portrait as an unmarked grave. Do not seek the stone without the story, but even it cannot fit this hollow, and flesh shall not fail me. From here, cartilage, collagen, calcium whispers my descent. Witness what I've made of ruin. To our kind, death is no descending. Each year, bramble thick with thorn advances its assault. I rise, my dead, my living spill above the earth, push through blood soil until you are made to stalk. Tango, balance in cruel wind. Tango of limbs brown scar the landscape. Roots refuse to manumit my bone. Roots refuse to manumit my bone. We monument. Carry that in your descendant order. No longer gentle, but violent bush evergreening deep in winter's scorn. I'm gonna read 2 more poems, and then I think Kamara and I will have a conversation. Thank you all for listening. And I look forward to your questions as well, if you have any. So this is the title poem. It's called Heed the Hollow. I want to remember everything that has happened to me, history of my flesh, scar of her miscarriage. I take my own pills as I once learned to sign for my mother's birth control, preventative measures. I am learning to reproduce myself with the shape of my mouth's consuming. I'll swallow everything. I have to forget to live the way men read labels as invitations. I've heard women in my family talk of assault as I've heard men talk of assaulting. I'll be something to someone someday or nothing but spill. Truth be told, I want to be the last side effect in the disease. I'll settle for a curse. I'm trying to remember to forget the colonizer's name on my medical chart scripting my back. I straighten into narrative and carry it in spite of my name, how he grabs me as if prescribed. I want to forget the way he's had me over the counter taking him, the way he told me you were almost a power bottom. And just because I'd like to end with, I think this is the most, well, the cake poem was kind of happy, but this is, I think, the most uplifting poem in the book. It's the last one. The first poem in the book is Power Bottom, which I read earlier, and so this is the last one. It's called Bottom Power. Praise the bottom of USA, her blood and sweat in spite of death, deep gulf, spinning sea, stretch of moist marsh, cultured into giving, whose salt tears trail into the vast forever and unknown. Praise the plush bottom of USA, its tangle of fiber, a seat in sanctuary, the soft pull from bowl by hard hands, afterlife living in the leftover lust of prize. Praise the hard bottom of USA, his cane erected woefully in your honor, sweet juice on the chin, the return each year bent on living, whose seed lives on in rich, rum-filled romance and ripe abandon. Praise the soft bottom of USA, her sugar tits still raw with rot of generations, her cotton gin gyration inflected into the games of children chattering rhymes from the street corner. Praise the sweet bottom of the South, our heft of holler ringing into present tense, the lift of fist festered into submission, the perverse sway of swamp housing the hush of history, the hollow of saltwater cyclone, seeing and sealing truth, our tapestry of tabby toppling over as testimony. Praise the black bottom, praise the bottom of the black bottom, everything lost and lingering, our bone of brick still breaking, our emptiness, our backward lick of life, our distant desire, our quick quiet, our will and want, our silent sighs exalting, the cleft clit still singing in the labor of love. Praise the black bottom of the bottom, praise the blackest bottom, praise the bottommost black, praise the black, praise the black, praise the bottom, praise the bottom, praise the bottom. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Am I unmuted? I think so. You can hear me, right?
Yes, I can. Wait, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I can hear you. Wow. Okay. Whew. I wish we could have taken a moment after those beautiful and heart-wrenching poems. Thank you, Malcolm. Dr. Tariq, I'm sorry, for reading. those poems today on Juneteenth in this series, Poetry is Protest. I don't know about anyone at home, but I am just moved and emotional and a little hot over here. And I have you to thank for that. So again, thank you for reading. I don't know if you're at home. Usually when these readings would happen in person, you know, there'd be some reaction, there'd be some snaps, there'd be some there'd be some oh. So if you're at home and you felt that, you know, this is your moment to feel that out loud. Just do that for yourself.
Yeah, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, and I have a few questions, but I'd really like to pass it off to the people who are listening right now, eventually after my few questions, to hear their thoughts and questions and comments about your reading, and perhaps its relationship to some of the historical sites that are hosting, like the Royal House and Public History and Juneteenth, why we're here today. So feel free to send in your questions to this question box, and people/I will be going through them and would love to read them aloud. So, but to begin, I just have to say that one of my favorite things about this book and your work and your reading is how it refuses to not think of bodies in relationship to Black history and to memorializing and remembering Black history, and the body as not necessarily abstract all the time, but the physical body, the tongue, the bottom, the hair and the flesh. And so I really appreciated that from this reading, and it jumped out to me while I was reading your book as well as tonight. And I wanted to perhaps begin, sorry, as a poet, I have to begin with the specifics and the lines. And my questions are often around lines that I really love that maybe we can expand off of. And so there's a series of poems in this book, and I would encourage everyone to actually, you know, read and get the book if you enjoyed this reading. There's a series of poems about different places, I guess, you've gone to in person, that the speaker throughout the poem that the book visits, that are sites of enslavement or sites in which, you know, enslavement is somehow romanticized or erased. And there's this line that's repeated throughout. You write, "I heed a path trodden for me before." And it's sort of this refrain and this repetition that comes back and back again and again. And so I guess my first question is kind of two parts. Is one, how did you come to be inspired to write about these specific sites and specific places? Maybe you gave us a little background on how you got to Sullivan's Island, but perhaps why you chose to write about it specifically. And then why the repetition or the refrain of that line, "I heed a path trodden for me before." Why that technique? I can't wait to hear your answer.
Well, first of all, I love a line read, so thank you. So the first poem, so some of those places are Stone Mountain in Atlanta, Georgia, Tybee Island near Savannah, Georgia, then Sapelo Island, which is a sea island off the coast of Georgia.
Right.
The first poem I wrote in that vein was on Stone Mountain, because I don't know if people have gone to Stone Mountain, but it's a mountain, I guess. I think it's made of granite, I'm not sure, but you can walk up it. It's like a hiking trail that a lot of people walk up. And I think it was my first time, maybe my only time going to Stone Mountain when I moved back to Atlanta in like 2016, 2017. And when I got to the top, I was just thinking about being on top of this mountain that has so much like racial history. There's also an emblem to the Confederacy, like into the mountain itself. And I believe it was like a meeting place for the KKK, and maybe still is, I'm not sure. And so like what it meant to take that walk that so many other people have walked, even like for various reasons. But then as I began to go to the other sites, I was thinking like, I'm not the only one that has done this before, or am I the only one that's done this before? Even if it's that specific act of like going to Sullivan's Island, me like walking there, other people have made that same walk, even if it wasn't like a physical visiting of the island. So Toni Morrison's Bench by the Road project, that was there before I got there. And so it's just a way of, I guess, acknowledging that different people will like trace history or go in search of history, even if we don't hear about it. And each of us have our own interpretation of that and our own way of keeping it. So the poems are about my meditations on what I'm doing myself, while also acknowledging that there's these other people as well who have done the same thing. Yeah.
That's so beautiful. And it also makes me think that, I know you were talking about the bench project, and I think that a lot of your poems sort of act as that bench as well, and let the reader do a sort of witnessing, but from the speaker's perspective. Again, with that body in history. Sorry, I'm really excited to talk to you, and yeah, and it reminds me of a few other lines from the book that also think about the ways in which we experience physical sites of history in different ways and come to it in different means and from different perspectives, right? And I think that your work on this articulates that in really clear ways. And you didn't read this poem today, but I have to say this line: on the road to chocolate plantation, you write, in the end, we each take what we need to survive, in reference to one of these sites. And it got me thinking about Black history and Black people's understanding, definition, relationship, praxis of survival, and what those two do together. And it got me thinking also about Black historical sites being accessible, to Black people, and the significance of that versus, or maybe in relation to, always entangled with, the hyper accessibility, right? And ubiquity of monuments that now seem to be coming down in different places of Confederate leaders, right? And other races. And so I wonder if you can think with me, talk with me about access, but also, I had this question about the difference or similarities between monumentalizing someone or something and memorializing. But what messed me up is the line from Self-Portrait as an Unmarked Grave, we monument. And so I wonder what you think that maybe some of your work is doing, or maybe out loud, about Black history and how the difference between, or the similarities between it being memorialized and being monumentalized, if that rings any bells or resonates in that way.
Or maybe it's just one I haven't thought about. Maybe I use those words interchangeably. Now I have to think. But the line that you point out about I think the line is, we monument. Before that is monument or something.
Yeah.
But I think because, wait, now I have to find it. Oh, to manument my bone, we monument. Yeah, I had discovered that what the word manument means, like to free something.
Yeah.
And so that's where, I don't know, I begin to think about how we can like manument ourselves and like make our own monument, how we are our own monuments to our histories. And so, even though those bodies could not be released from the earth, we as Black people are still monuments to that legacy. And so we have the power to create those monuments in ways that don't have to exist only in a plaque. And I think poetry is one of, I'm having a grand thought. Thank you for this question.
Go ahead.
Those ways that history becomes accessible to people who can't go to sites, or for sites that we don't know, or like no one has processed. And I don't know, I think about that a lot, especially with Black people writing poetry, and so many Black people write narrative poetry that's like writing the life of like Horace Pimpin, for example, who was like a Black artist. And so how is that different from a biography? Because poetry, there's so much more room that you can play with and invent and create.
Yeah.
That it's like a different way of getting people to think and connect with history. And I think that's what I like about poetry, is that it allows space for that type of innovation and creation that leads to connection. So I did want some of these poems, the site-specific poems, to be, the note section is also kind of large, I think, for poetry, but not large, just a few pages maybe. But the note section was really important to me because I wanted to explain why I went to these, well, not why I went to these places, but what they were and what they mean to different people. Because I didn't know about Sullivan's Island until I just happened upon it.
Right.
What if we all knew about Sullivan's Island? How, I mean, we're living in this moment right now, we're seeing what change, like what's us people not being silent and making noise can do. Did that answer your question? I don't really know.
Yeah, I think so. No, you answered it and more. And I don't know if people at home are also taking illegible notes in their notebook, but that is what I'm doing over here. And I loved what you were talking about in terms of the work, you know, making some of these places accessible in a way. Like it can't be the physical space. You can't lift it up. You can't take it everywhere. But I think part of what your poetry is doing is getting at the speaker's complex and entangled feelings in relationship to that as a Black queer subject experiencing those historical places too. You know.
Also because like a plaque, I won't name the museum, but I went to this museum in Michigan, and they had this exhibit on like Black life, and they just had objects and whatnot displayed with a little placard that said what it was. But there was no challenging the audience to think outside of the fact of this thing's subjectivity. Like why is it important to this narrative that you're trying to craft, or like what people to leave with? And I think museums are so important because they don't only house these artifacts and stories, but they also can complicate narratives to get people to like think about their own lives and their own experiences in ways that poetry can as well. So I guess like poetry can be like a type of museum.
Yeah, a different type of museum. But and when I was reading through your book, I thought it was really archival was the word that came to mind for me. There's a lot of different, like even the Erasure poems is creating a new type of source, some would say. I would say. Yeah. So many thoughts. And I think this also, you talk about museums complicating narratives. They also, as some of the sites that are partnered here today, challenge, right? Narratives that erase, you know, Black people, enslaved Black people from that history, right? And maybe not even it's like an erasure, but also the lived experiences of people, right? And so I think that's also a sort of work that poets can try and wiggle in a different direction as well. Is like what was the feeling? Not what was the feeling, but what does it feel now for me to experience and learn about this history today, and what's the significance of that? I have a few more questions. I just want to remind people if they have other questions. Oh my God, there's so many questions. I didn't know to scroll down. So I think that maybe since there's a lot of questions, maybe I'll just have one more and then I'll go into the others, which I will combine my last two questions, which were about poetry as protest and Juneteenth and its complicated history. But really, my question was about how does poetry protest? And then that may be a simple question, but there's a long tradition. You know, if you go to any poetry website, they have protest poetry canons, genres, you know, and maybe you can speak to how and if you think your poetry does a sort of protest. And then to tack onto that, where's the place of joy and or celebration with this complicated history of Juneteenth? Answer any of those, and I'm gonna try and look through these questions and listen to you.
Yeah. This is a good question. I mean, it's interesting for me because when I started graduate school, was interested in protest literature. I still am, but I had more of a focus on that. But I think when I started, I mean, you got me thinking about when I was like 10 in the library going to one, and the library set where the poetry was on this thin shelf. And that's not where I found out who Nikki Giovanni was, but that's where I started to read Nikki Giovanni. And her first books was called Black Feeling, Black Thought. I don't know if it was her first one or her second, but and those, a lot of them were protest poems. And then when I started reading more of Nikki, like when you get to her collection, My House, which I think came out in maybe 74, collection was more, I don't know, there's still that, I don't want to use that word militant, but there's still that protest feeling, but a lot of them were also about love in herself and like her house, which can be like different things like her family, her people. And so protest and poetry for me, I think now, 20 years later, can be, I don't know, about resistance, because I don't really necessarily think I write, like there are not many poems that I would call protest poems in this book, but like if I think about poetry as resistance, then a lot of these poems are doing that work, have that objective. I don't know, I think of poetry as like the voice of the people. Like I can just picture Pat Parker right now, like or like Lucille Clifton, like that's protest poetry to me as well. Yeah, I don't know, what do you think?
How does poetry protest, or what do I think your book is doing some type of protest poetry?
No, like your experience with protesting poetry.
I think that I'll keep this short. I think that poetry does work, I'm thinking about the protests that are happening right now. And I'm thinking about people holding up poems by Audre Lorde, by Nikki Giovanni, by so many others. And I think that many poets that I know don't think of their own work as doing protest poetry, but nonetheless, their poems are out there alongside poems that say Black Lives Matter, Black trans lives matter. And I think that I don't have an articulate, or I don't have a sort of general incisive thesis about that, but I know that poems that speak to people's lived experiences, that reflect and remember a history that is often erased, poems that, honor, people who have died senselessly, those that people have loved and those that people have loved from afar. I think that those do a type of protest by remembrance, by putting to language. I also think poets protest language and the sort of constructs that are in English, you know, and that is work too. But I'm gonna go to these questions because there's so much and I don't. Ooh, okay. Someone just asked, the kindness that you exude is infectious and beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Tariq. How do you nourish your own manifestation of kindness?
Oh, kindness?
Kindness.
Like being nice?
I think it can also be in relation to the well, would you call your poetry kind?
That's a good question.
Kind to whom, maybe? Kind to whom, maybe?
Yeah. Okay, so maybe there's a way of answering this question. I think that, because I mean, I think I'm a kind person. In my head, I'm not really a nice person, but like outwardly, I'm like a kind person. But I think of kind. There's this poem I have called Shinto, in which the narrative precedes the lyric, and it's like if you have like a mathematical proof where you have to like write every step out. And so the first line is me saying I wanted to write. A Shinto is basically a poem, if you don't know, that is composed of lines from other people's poems. So I wanted to slave narrative, pull sentences out of that, and then write about myself as a Black queer person. And to me, that did not feel right to do, to take someone else's words, especially people who did not have, some of whom did not have access to like documenting their own stories. These were collected, a lot of them from oral histories. And so it didn't sit right with me that I would take these words and then make them into my own experience when I did not, like our experiences were not like parallel. And so, I mean, that's the way that I like try to practice kindness, by also being considerate and thinking how will the work live on, who's going to read the work, and to also think about, I think that writing about a lot of this stuff is like very devastating. Like there's a whole erasure about Black death, and like that book on lynching that I do a whole erasure of this book on lynching, and it's just scenes of like sexual violence. And that can be a hard poem to get to. But to leave the reader with a poem like Bottom Power, where there's this praise poem that people won't leave the book feeling like totally down, for example. Like that's one way that I think practice kindness, or think about my readers, especially my Black readers and myself. I don't know, I try not to let the idea of the reader hinder too much of what I write, but there is, I think, if I think that I'm entering into a conversation, it has to be two-sided, and I just can't picture myself for the type of writer and poet that I am. That's really important to me, to think about care, I guess. Yeah, it's care, not kindness. Yeah, I think those two can be related for this question.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That was a great answer to that question. There are a couple of questions here about your literary inspirations. Perhaps one question about your inspiration or model to integrate poetry and activism. There's also questions about just in general, who are some of the writers who've inspired you?
I guess the easier of those would be talk about writers. So when I first started writing, like I said, Nikki Giovanni. Who else did I remember Nikki Giovanni. Oh, and then Alice Walker. I read a lot of Alice Walker, her writing in the, I think until the early 90s. So from when she first started writing in, I think the 70s up until the 90s. I really read a lot of that in high school, and that was really inspiring to me, and still is. So Nikki, Alice, I think in graduate school, I tried to read Gwendolyn Brooks, growing up at like 10, 15. It was just not for me at the time. But then I learned a lot more, and then I went back to it, and now Gwendolyn is really like a force in my life. And it's really, I don't know how people can write and not read Gwendolyn. Yeah. She's like a master at craft. So her Natasha Trethewey, I remember as well, was a big influence. I read her book Below Sophia. It was her second book. And what she also does with history herself. So Below Sophia and then Native Guard was her third, the book that a lot of people know. And in that, she also has a poem called Monument. I think that's about her mom in that book. And that was also the title of her selected poems that came out last year, I believe. So Natasha Trethewey, definitely. Nikki Finney, especially her book Rice. Lots of Black women, and then Anne Sexton, because she is very sad and erotic at the same time. So I get along with the Anne Sexton. What was the other part of that question?
No, your inspirations, your literary models. Oh, part of the question was about poetry and activism and inspiration for that. You mentioned a few.
Yeah, I think all of them. Yeah. All those writers, except for Anne Sexton. Actually, she could be an activist too. With she did some activism, but definitely both Nikki Giovanni and Nikki Finney. Alice Walker, of course, Natasha Trethewey, in the way that she writes about her family and then racial history in the United States and growing up as a mixed race Black woman and child. That's it.
There are some more questions. One of them, oh my gosh, I just lost it. There was a question about other sources that influence your poetry. I lost it. There's so many. But yeah, there was a question about your different sources that you incorporate in your poetry, and how they kind of get there.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of in this book, a lot of Bible verses, or I think Bible verses. It's just like phrases I heard growing up that I think are in the Bible. I didn't even check, but so just from going to church when I was younger and listening to the preacher or whatever. But in church, I would also write a lot of poems to pass. I was supposed to be paying attention, but if you follow the form of the sermon, you already know what's going to happen. So I would just write poems in the margin of the church bulletin. Even to this day, like I write in places where other people are talking, like coffee shops, and maybe that's because of church. But that, and then also art, a lot of visual art. I go to a lot of art galleries, and sometimes I do some arts writing. And let me see what else. Also the art archives in general. If I have, I don't know, I'm fascinated by history and things that I don't know and people don't know. I'm also very nosy, so going into some archive and reading some letters. I love to do that. And just to, so I'll go to the art, like when I was a student at Emory, I would just go and type in my hometown, Savannah, Georgia, and stuff will pop up. Like there was a group of Black women who had a literary society in the early, it was either the early 20th century or the late 19th century. These middle-class Black women who got together to talk about books, and that's something that I would not have known about my life. And the Literary Society was named after Frances Harper, who's also a Black poet. And then there's also, when I went to archives, I found out there was this, I guess, fortune teller who used to live in Savannah. Savannah's also like one of those haunted southern cities, but they have her crystal globe or whatever in the archive for you to look at as well. And just like reading through letters and finding out stuff. influences. Yeah, and just looking at life and people. Right now, I'm cataloging articles, the titles of articles that I see on the internet about everything that's happening in the world. And because I don't want to bombard myself with information, I just copy down the title. And then I think titles, if you like read them, can be made into a poem later on, or I'm sure they will inspire something in me. But yeah, I guess I'm a collager, kind of collage person with words.
As a reader, collage really resonates with, like, I guess, your methodology in the book. I think we may have time for one more question. And it's really, I don't know how I got stuck with this job of choosing between these questions. Would you like a question about joy and how to feel joy now, or how do you feel the poetry? Both about feelings.
Wait, say it again.
Would you rather? I'm gonna give you that.
You said there's a question about joy and then a question about how do you feel poetry?
How do you feel the poetry of others within your soul? Cadence, imagery, tethers that link with past, present, person with person. And now we're doing that question. We're ending with that question about how do you feel poetry? And actually, I just want to say one thing about that, is that I think with all of the viral violence against trans people that's on video, violence against women that's on video, violence against Black people on video, I think it is important to think about how do you feel, like how do you like not be numb in certain ways. Well, numbness as coping, numbness as survival. But this question is about how do you feel other people's poetry within your soul, cadence, imagery. What do you think?
So deep. And I don't, I hope I can answer that question. I'm really interested in it. How do I feel other people's poetry? I guess it's just like if something that like, so I don't know why I'm trying to answer this question, but I really want to for myself as well. But sometimes art just like resonates with you in ways, or I should say me, I don't want to speak to nobody's experience. It resonates with me in ways that I don't know why at the moment. And that's like the best kind actually, because I have no, I have nothing to point to say why, but I can try to find out why, and that could be a journey, or I can just accept it and just be so appreciative that there's art in the world that makes me have feelings, that make me feel something that I didn't know I was capable of for I don't know what reason. But art, how do I feel other people's, I'm just speaking of art in general now, not even just poems, but for poems, for example, oh wait, I have this book right here. So there's this book by my friend Nabila Lovelace called Sons of Achilles. And Nabila is such, I picked this book up to read, to find one poem that I knew wasn't in there, but I wanted to be in there. And it wasn't in there, but then I just got stuck reading the book because the words are so addictive, like the way that she writes. It just makes me feel inspired. Maybe I'm talking toward an answer. So like inspiration for myself as a writer is one way that I feel, but also like the craft that people put into poems, and you can tell that they really thought about the delivery of it. That's one answer, but also just straight up feelings. So I don't know, people are human. There's 3 times that I can remember that I cried while I was reading, and that I was listening. One of them was Dear Mama by Tupac, and I had grown up with that song. I knew it in and out, but I was listening to it one day when I was like 21 or 22 in my apartment by myself, and it was just too much for me. And then the second time was when I was reading Corregidora by Gail Jones, and it's the part where she walks in and finds her husband with another woman. And just like following that character up until that point I was so mad for her, but also because I'm a Pisces. And then the third time was I did not plan to have, I just have these books right here, was reading Wishing for Wings by Soto Saint. Soto Saint, also because it's Pride Month, was a gay Black Haitian American. I think he died in like 94, 95. And so he wrote this book after his partner died, also, who was HIV positive. And then he died later, like less than a year later, I think. But this book is like a monument to their life together, and also the AIDS movement. It's not AIDS movement, but epidemic, I guess, crisis. And their community as well. Like you see so much about community in that book that you can just see the life that he had as an artist. He was a full-time artist, I believe. Things that I connect with, like that's how, I don't know if I answered that question, but that's just how I feel the poetry. And then, wait, you're gonna say something?
No. I was gonna say, yeah, I think you answered the question.
What was the joy question?
There was a joy question. It's hard for me to keep.
How do you joy?
Yeah, it was about how to sustain joy.
Oh, yeah. I think, that's a very important question right now, and it's something I think about a lot. I don't know. I think to remember that, I mean, it's different from person to person, but I think a lot of it, for me right now, I find joy in knowing that I come from a very rich history of resistance in the first place, and resilience and survival. And so what that looks like. And so looking at videos of people dancing. Have you seen that video of You About to Lose Your Job, the remix?
Yes, it's currently my favorite.
I love looking at that video because, I mean, listening to it, it's like Black people are so creative and we're so funny and we love to revise something. And so that is something that brings me joy, just knowing that also other Black people are experiencing joy, and how can I access this and how can I be a part of it? And that's something that I think has done a lot for us, like in this moment.
Ooh.
Is my video still on?
Yeah, I think that there's a poll that just got sent out, and our videos are also still on. Thank you for that answer. I think it perfectly relates to our conversation about like the access of history and the importance of it. But thanks.
Thank you.
Wow. Hi, everyone. Thank you for such an engaging conversation. And I just want to say thank you again to Malcolm for sharing his work with us. Thank you, Kamar, for leading the question and answers portion of the talkback. And I want to end on one of the lines from your poems, Malcolm, where you say, I want to remember everything that's happened to me. And for me, that ties right back to our mission at the Royal House and Slave Quarters, which is dedicated to ensuring the rediscovery of Northern slavery through the lives and artifacts of enslaved people whom the royals enslaved. And I think what your poetry does is ask us to think about not only historical responsibility, but you go on the exploration about how that has impacted you, how race sexuality, gender has impacted you living today. And I think, you know, in terms of the conversations about museums and monuments, that when it comes to us, you know, as a museum, it is our responsibility to not only tell the history of slavery and get it right, but also to connect it to the ways in which the historical legacies of enslavement impact Black communities today. And one of those ways is through police violence and mass incarceration. And we see so many people out on the streets fighting for justice and fighting for freedom. And I love thinking about how we can think about this freedom movement and a long history of freedom movements going all the way back to some of the enslaved people who lived at our site in the 18th century. And so I just really think that, you know, all of these conversations, you know, that were had today were really amazing and engaging. And I hope as you all leave here and celebrate Juneteenth, you think about what freedom means to you. And I hope that you're inspired and also activated. And before we wrap up, I just want to say thank you again to our partners with the Shaw 54th Regiment Memorial Committee. And if you want to know more information about them, you can go to Shaw 54th Memorial Restoration.org. And if you want to know more information about the Royal House and slave quarters, you can follow us. You can go to our website at royalhouse.org. We're also on Twitter at Royal House, Instagram at Royal House 1737, and Facebook at Royal House Slave Quarters. So once again, thank you all for you know, giving up a portion of your night with us. And I really hope that you all feel inspired and carried to, you know, leave here and go read some more poetry and to think about history and to think about how it impacts us today, but how it can inspire us to move forward for the future. Thank you again, Malcolm. Thank you again, Kamara. Thank you again, Lamerchi. Thank you again, Lucia. Yeah, I'm excited to keep these conversations going.
Definitely.
Any last words?
No, I'm just very thankful. This is really nice. And Kamara has some really great questions. Like, my mind is still there for a lot of them. I wish I had me a note-taking device with me, but yeah.
All right. Well, Lamerchi, you're muted.
I would like to thank Malcolm for expanding us so broadly with your word magic in historic and contemporary times, that these are words that will inspire us to renew. So thank you so much for your work, and Kara for choreographing this moment, and the sponsoring partners who are restoring the 54th. And I just want to encourage people to also visit the Museum of African American History at www.maah.org. Thank you so much. And thank you all. And thank you, Kamala.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Have a great night.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
As soon as we figure out how to end this.
All right.